These are my top differences between Age of Empires 4 and the Age of Empires games of old. Particularly, I'll be reflecting on Age of Empires 2, as it's largely considered to be the most significant, substantial entrance in the franchise, and is, from what I can tell, most people's favourite. Not all, but most. I will reflect on Age of Empires 3 a little bit, but by and large, let's dissect my top differences between Age of Empires 4 and 2. Just for context, I'll be glossing over some of the more straightforward things like Age of Empires 4 is in Game Pass, changes to graphics and animations, but actually I'm more interested in the game itself. How does it play and function, and what are the main differences between them? This should inform potential buyers, but also players, young, old, and everywhere in between. My name is JumboPixel, and let's jump straight in to my top 3 plus a bonus one, differences between Age of Empires 4 and the Age of Empires games of old. First and foremost, we should really talk about aging up. It's literally in the name, so it would be a crime to not address it. In Age of Empires 2, we would age up normally by building 2 buildings from our age and meeting the resource requirement. In the early ages, of course, here's looking at you, food. Age of Empires 2 brought us through the ages and sort of required us to build at least a couple of buildings in each stage before we could advance. You could argue that most players would be doing that anyway, but it was a rigid requirement. Age of Empires 4 changes the formula a little bit in 2 key ways. Firstly, there is much more of a focus on the resource requirement, and really no, or mostly no, strict requirements on certain buildings that you have to build. For example, you don't need a certain number of buildings from that age to advance through. However, the second key difference, and this one matters I think more for gameplay, is the fact that in Age of Empires 4, we're required to actually build things every age, not just a castle in the feudal age, but actually every age. We're required to build a monument of sorts to progress through into the next age. Why does it matter in particular? Well, because of course we can assign our populations to build it, so we have much more control over how fast or slow that final and most important part of the progression takes place. And that really matters when you're trying to balance resources and units and what to farm and what to mine while also balancing your progression. Next up, this is a big one, slightly technical, but bear with me because it's actually quite straightforward once you understand it. The way that the game looks and the way that the game is sort of rendered and moving really makes a difference to the playing experience. In Age of Empires games of old, let's take Age of Empires 2, they tended to be isometric in nature. What that means is that the way the game looks, it tends to make objects appear as though they are the same distance from the camera. There is no warping for space. It was, of course, by and large, more of a 2D world. In more recent editions, in Age of Empires 4, however, it's a 3D perspective. And that really changes the way that the game looks and feels, right? Even if we put sort of different zoom levels or speeds or whatever aside and just purely look at the way that the game is rendered, Age of Empires 4 is 3D. Well, what does that mean in comparison to the isometric perspective? Well, as you can probably tell, it means that vanishing points make objects that are closer to the camera appear bigger. Okay, so we're getting that sort of morphing of objects and sizes, rendering them in a much more 3D way. And that is really one of the key things that helps to bring Age of Empires 4, or at least tries to bring Age of Empires 4, into a more modern experience with increased graphical fidelity. Thirdly, and this is a big one, and it sort of encompasses lots of different factors, but I'm going to try and present it in a way that makes sense. I'm talking about combat, but particularly about combat bonuses, okay? And I'm going to draw on a couple of key examples rather than delving deep into the paper, scissors, rock that is unit combat, but pull out a couple of key differences between, in particular, the definitive edition of Age of Empires 2 and Age of Empires 4. First and foremost, hill bonuses. Basically, in Age of Empires 4, they're all but gone. In Age of Empires 2, standing on a hill would give you a 25%, I believe, combat bonus, and the inverse would be the same, vice versa. In Age of Empires 4, for the most part, those hill bonuses, aside from line of sight impacts, have been completely removed, so you need to worry a little less about the terrain. But in Age of Empires 4, we have a new feature kind of taking its place, in that we can send our units to essentially guard or stand inside of watchtowers and walls, right? So we don't have the hill bonuses, but there are different strategic positioning that we can take advantage of in Age of Empires 4 that we weren't previously able to do. The other big thing that sort of aligns quite well with this, because you're probably using archers in many of these cases, particularly to defend your walls. It makes a lot of sense to have ranged units up there, right? One of the other major changes has been the changes to projectiles. And I'd like to remind you, of course, that arrows that your archers or longbowmen fire are indeed projectiles. In Age of Empires 2, projectiles had a travel distance and time, just like they did in real life. What that meant was that if a unit was firing at another unit that was moving, the projectile would miss, because the moving target has shifted away from the initial position where the archer was firing at. In Age of Empires 4, however, it's completely different. Projectiles are essentially homing missiles. If you shoot an arrow, it will generally hit the target, even if they're moving back and forth or trying to dodge your shots. The implications of this are actually quite wide-reaching, and not just in single-player, but particularly in multiplayer matches too. It removes a lot of the micromanaging, a lot of the dancing units left and right to try and dodge arrows that we witnessed and experienced in Age of Empires 2, arguably taking away a strategic element, but also, on the flip side, makes it much more simple. You don't have to be dodging left and right with your horses, which in theory is kind of ridiculous, and you can sort of let the combat play out a little bit more than you would have been able to in a previously drawn or even fight. Those differences are massive, and they create or essentially shape a very different overall combat system in Age of Empires 4 that in general has less micromanagement, I think, is the key takeaway from this final difference. And now let's move through into my bonus difference. I chose to make this a bonus difference not just because top 4 sounds a lot more awful than top 3, but also because the wider point is somewhat obvious, but the finer details really matter. And it's all about playable civs. So in Age of Empires 2, the game launched with 13 civilizations we could play as, 13 factions, races, whatever you want to call them, and then eventually it ended up with 39, so it tripled over the course of its life. Age of Empires 4, however, launched with only 8, making it one of the, if not the most restricted launch in terms of civs in the franchise's recent history, and indeed in recent memory. However, there are two counter-arguments to this, of course, that I need to address. First and foremost, this is a new game and Age of Empires 2 is old, so it's unfair. Fair enough. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the civs within Age of Empires 4 are more unique. They are more diverse. I argue they have much more of their own character, abilities, and nuances that make them feel genuinely different to play. Some of the more linear basic ones are fairly similar, right? The bonuses for the English, for example, are not too dissimilar from the Holy Rollies. But then when you move through to, say, the Rus or the Mongols, man, big differences in these civs. So there are fewer in Age of Empires 4, but they're more diverse. Thank you very much for watching the top differences between 4 and 2 in the Age of Empires world. My name has been JumboPixel. If you enjoyed this and you'd like some more strategy gaming content, do consider smashing that red subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.